Welcome to the Agile Data Podcast, where we talk about the merging of Agile, product, and data patterns in a simply magical way. My first book, An Agile Data Guide to Information Product Canvas, is published on Amazon. If you hear your stakeholders say, hey, that's not what I wanted, and then you hear your team reply with, but that's what you asked for, then you probably have a problem capturing data requirements. The Information Product Canvas is a pattern template that is a quick and simple way to solve that problem. Head over to agiledataguides.com and click on the Green Book link to buy a copy now. Welcome to the Agile Data Podcast. I'm Shane Gibson.
And I'm Andy Cutler.
Hey, Andy, thanks for coming on the show. Today, we're going to have an intriguing chat around data modeling and whether it's been done, not been done, going to be done, and how tools and AI can fit into it. So it's a passion of mine. But before we jump into that conversation, why don't you give a bit of background about yourself to the audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shane. So my name's Andy Cutler, and I've been working in the data space for about 25 years. So back in 1999, when I was working for a tiny little UK drum and bass record label called Good Looking Records, I was given the role of updating the company website. And that ran on a technology called Cold Fusion. And I got quite into web design. So I then managed to get myself a job, and I guess it was the first IT job that I had, designing websites. Then that website agency bought a SQL Server 2000 license. And I know there's older versions of SQL. I'm really aware of that. But that was the first version of SQL that I got my hands on. And I was tasked with building the data models and the store procedures to run CMS systems. And then 5 years later, so mid-2000s, I'm working in the data warehousing space. So I learned everything about database normalization, third normal form, so on and so forth. And then I was told to unlearn that all because I needed to denormalize everything for data warehouses. So I've literally worked for the last 20 years in data warehousing. The last few years has all been cloud-based. I actually started my cloud journey with AWS and Redshift. That was, we're going on for sort of 12, 13 years ago now. And then when Azure really started to motor with the products and services, I was then using tools like Azure SQL Data Warehouse. That then moved into Synapse Analytics. And for the last couple of years, it's been Microsoft Fabric. So really, it's been predominantly the Microsoft data space that I've been working in.
Excellent. Cold Fusion and SQL Server in the early days. That was back in the days where we had to buy our own hardware and put it under our desk or in a cupboard or pre-data centers. I remember back then we were doing some stuff in my first job and we were buying compact 386s, and the argument was, do we get an SX or a DX? And I can't remember. I think had 4 meg of memory and it cost the organization $35,000 New Zealand dollars back then. Yeah, times have changed, right? Now you can spin up those kind of things by just putting your credit card in or even getting a free tier, and you got a massive amount of firepower in there.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is it's also a little bit disconcerting now because all that compute is sitting in the cloud. Certain vendors like to show compute in certain ways and show you cores, and other vendors, they like to obfuscate that behind other kind of terminology, which, yeah, I guess Microsoft do. So you're trying to map the cloud compute with what you're doing with on-premises, right? And saying, okay, I've got a certain amount of cores and I'm running this certain amount of workload on premises. What does that look like when I go to the cloud? And I'm then dealing with a service that I can't exactly 100% map to those on-premises cores. But yeah, I totally get it. You're choosing hardware to run that software. You're configuring that software as well. You're configuring that software to death to get as much as you can out of that hardware.
Yeah, and I think like you, when I had my consulting company, when Redshift and AWS came in, we jumped on board really fast because in those days, you either had to buy a big $1 million Teradata box or you had to buy some Oracle database and again, rack and stack it with some leased hardware. And when Redshift turned up, that really was the first cloud database for analytics. And it's interesting how it's lost market share. It was first to market, and it's obviously been taken over by Snowflake and Databricks and a few others. So, what's interesting for me is we see these patterns getting repeated. We see databases where we used to have to install them, and then we see databases as an appliance where you buy the hardware and the database used to come with it pre installed. Now we're seeing cloud databases, Redshift being the first, and some more, should I say, modern. So ones that solve some of the problems. I'm going to have to vacuum your database for anybody that's dealt with a Redshift cluster before. And so one of the things that's interesting is this idea of data modeling, because I've been in the data space for 35 years and we've always modeled data. But every technology wave, it seems to become hot and then cold. It's, yep, we model and then no, we democratize and people can do all the work without any conscious data modeling. So what are you seeing in the modeling space in your part of the world at the moment?
I'm seeing, and I'm going to speak honestly and off the cuff here, I'm seeing a repeated and constant battle to make sure that data modeling is at the forefront of a data platform project, that it isn't just about the technology and it isn't just about the data layout patterns that we've seen. One of my sort of bugbears is that I've seen a lot of articles on LinkedIn comparing architecture patterns with data modeling patterns. And I'm thinking, hang on, you're really comparing apples to oranges. The architecture enables the modeling is put over the architecture. I can't imagine a scenario where any CIO or CTO is going to talk to members of their team and ask them, should we architect our data a certain way versus modeling it a certain way? No, they are complementary. So in the last few weeks, I've been thinking about the data modeling side of things and asking myself, is it because it's hard to do? Is it because it requires thought and time and collaboration, where sometimes technology is a little bit of an easier thing to do? There's still lots of human elements in using and deploying and working with technology, but I just feel that data modeling, you really have to have that community grounding where people are working together to get what they need from the data into a shape that's actually useful for their business. So yes, that was my framing on that.
It's an interesting lens. And for me, I'm with you, right? I talk about data architecture layers. So how we're laying out the architecture of our data across our platform. And I'm a great fan of layered architectures. I've used them for many years and I see massive value in them. And then once I have an idea of the layers, then I can talk about what data modeling patterns we want to use in each layer. And I'm a big fan of mixed model arts, which Joe Reese talks about. Because in my experience, I've never actually used a single data modeling pattern. Even back when I was dimensionally modeling, I always had a persistent staging area that was some form of native relational model that mapped the structure of the source system before I moved it into the dimensional model. So if I think about that in terms of data architecture, and then I think in terms about data modeling, and then I think in terms of technology, and I ask myself this question: if I was moving into the data domain for the first time at the beginning of my career, where do I find any information around data modeling? Like, how do I learn? Because the courses and the books that we had when we started, the books are still there, but the courses have disappeared to a degree. So I think part of the problem is lack of accessibility to that content for some reason. But the other thing that you just raised, and I've never thought about it this way, is as a technologist, if I want to learn a product, I grab the product, I give it a go, I read some of the documentation. Well, these days I'll probably Perplexity it, and I get to have a go and I get immediate feedback. So I can install the software or turn it on in the cloud, and then I'm immediately able to log on. And then I can give it a whack. I can try to use it and it will give me feedback. If I'm doing that with data modeling, that's not true. I can't just turn something on. I can't get instantaneous feedback that my model is good or bad or right or wrong or doing what I want. And yeah, it's an interesting point you raise. Maybe that is the reason that people love to play with technology, because they can just learn it. They get instantaneous feedback. And probably that adrenaline rush, that first time you load the data up and your dashboard turns up with a pretty graph, you're like, that was pretty cool. That's a bit of an endorphin hit. Whereas I create a data model in Miro. Yeah, that's a picture. It's an interesting lens you've got. Do you agree that one of the problems is lack of access to content and ways of learning what data modeling is and how you use it?
I think it always has to be a constant conversation with the data people around modeling. And it always has to be brought up, and it always has to be marketed and communicated that the technology is just the starting point. Modeling comes into it as well. You are delivering a product that is the amalgamation of the technology, of course it is, the process that the organization requires that data technology to do. And you've got there through modeling and landing the data in the right way for that organization. If we go back to resources, and you touched on a point there around the books that we had access to and the resources that we had. So yeah, I remember Steve Hoberman's data modeling books. I then remember the Kimball Group books. I mean, they were, and I'm looking at the Kimball Reader on my shelf right now, and the Dimensional Modeling Toolkit, because yes, you required database technology to implement that model, but the technology could be from Microsoft, it could be from Oracle, MySQL, Postgres. It didn't need to be a specific vendor. You were applying a process to a technology. So unless you're guided towards these resources, and I remember being told in the early 2000s to go, I think it was a database administrator who told me to go and learn about normal form and database normalization, because the data had to be structured in a certain way to facilitate a transactional system, right? Database normalization. And then when I started to move into more of the data warehousing and analytics side of things, again, I was guided, I was told. It was a MicroStrategy consultant that I was shadowing so that I could understand the data warehouse that he was implementing. Again, that consultant pointed me in the right direction. He pointed me towards books and said, I can teach you the basics of this now, but of course, you're going to have to get hands-on. You're going to have to learn this. And at some stage, I was told that I would have to learn these things and get hands-on. And I think that unless you've got those people now who are guiding people to do that, people have got to be very proactive, and they've got to be going out there and they've got to be saying, okay, I'm building a data platform. I'm using this technology. What else do I need in terms of my knowledge that I need to apply to that as well? So there is a certain amount of guidance, and this is, I hope, being passed down by people. There are great people out there like Johnny Winter who are talking about data modeling, and we'll get on to the data modeling AI topic in a little bit that I essentially took from Johnny, right? Johnny was talking about this, and I looked at this and thought, wow, this is relevant. I like this. But yeah, so that's what I feel. The other thing is, if you look at vendors, are vendors necessarily pointing people in the direction of the modeling processes? I'm a Microsoft data developer, and throughout the years, there have been various books around how to apply things like dimensional modeling and modeling patterns to Microsoft products, right? And even now, you can go onto the Microsoft Fabric Learn documentation, and in the warehouse, the Fabric Warehouse documentation, there's resources around dimensional modeling. They will tell you how you can do that. So the vendors, like I said, have been providing some of this guidance and some of this documentation, but it's small fry, right? It's a few pages in their documentation on how to do it. So you've got to be mindful of the fact that when you're coming at these data platforms, that you've got to be doing the modeling behind it as well. And it has to be front and center to a project. Yeah, so that's what I think about that.
Yeah, and I agree with you that if I remember, a lot of my learning was from that grumpy old DBA when you used to deploy something and it ran like shit. I remember the standard response from the grumpy old DBA is when you said, oh, my ETL loads are going too slow. They used to always reply with, compared to what? It was the standard response. And then eventually they go and help you tune it. They typically tell you it was the data model or your code that was wrong, not the database. And then again, if I think back, I think you're right that often the projects we're doing were expensive, and it was expensive because of people and time. And therefore, there was a whole hierarchy of mentoring because you couldn't afford to have somebody just rush off and do something that didn't fit the way everybody else was working. So there was always a mentoring process where somebody more senior, experienced than you, took you on the journey to learn to do things the way they did. And I think what's happened is as we've got new technologies, we've got new forms of democratization, and therefore people are able to do the work quicker and faster using those tools. And we've lost that mentoring process, that knowledge transfer outside the tool itself. And also, people aren't being taught what we got taught in the early days. Like we did a podcast or a webinar, and we're talking about data layered architectures and a template that I've been working on. And one of the questions in that was, is the data persisted in the layer, or is it virtualized, right? Or is it temporal in memory? And one of the questions we got online is, what is data persistence? And I sat back and went, holy shit. And one of the comments from Chris, who was doing the webinar, and Ramona with me, was, we know what persistence is because we've worked with tools when Excel didn't save. And if you didn't hit the little diskette and persisted that data down to your laptop and your laptop crashed, you'd lose it. Now we've got Google Sheets where you type, it saves, it persists the data. We don't have to care about that. And so I think for some of us, we forget some of the core foundational concepts that we just learned by doing things outside of data to a degree that we've applied. So if we think about that, is the problem with data modeling right now lack of tools? Because really there is still a lack of data modeling tools in our data stack. Or is it a lack of mentoring, and therefore is AI the answer? Do we actually now see AI bots or AI clones or whatever we want to call them that actually become the data modeling mentors for people that don't have a physical mentor like we did? What do you think?
I think that the technology itself, and I'm talking about, it could be Microsoft technology, it could be Oracle, it could be Databricks, Snowflake, so on and so forth. They don't have any guided ways of creating a model. I reckon the last time that I used a piece of software that guided me through the process that was very aligned with a very specific data modeling technique was Analysis Services Multidimensional, where objects inside this model were named after a specific modeling pattern. So your facts, your measures, and your dimensions, if we're talking about Kimball dimensional modeling. So that was really the last time that I used a piece of software that was quite aligned and essentially had a wizard that would take you through a modeling process. Because, of course, now we've got different modeling processes. We could model, yes, third normal form. We could use dimensional modeling. We could model it data vault. And no vendor is locking themselves into a specific pattern, right? Vendors are saying, hey, you can bring this specific type of modeling to our software. So they're not baking in a specific modeling process. One of my real asks in terms of software is to start to bring in some of these modeling aspects. I would love functionality like slowly changing dimensions. So this is a dimensional modeling concept which adds historical records to a reference table, to a dimension table. And this is just my experience with the software that I've used. I really only see Databricks that have done this slowly changing dimension type 2 in their Delta Live tables or Lakehouse declarative pipelines. DBT, they've implemented slowly changing dimensions in something called snapshots. So it is there, but it's a little piecemeal, and it's not necessarily being massively called out in terms of this is the modeling pattern and this is the feature that we've implemented for you to be able to realize that modeling pattern. So then you were talking about AI, right? And this is where we start to get into productivity. This is where we start to get into how can someone with not much experience of something ask AI to help them. And this is a classic case of where AI can help and start to move someone towards understanding how they work with the business, how they would evolve a pattern as well. And like you were saying before, people can get hands-on with technology. They can get cracking with technology. It's binary. Something's going to work or it's not. If you model some data, you might not know whether that model works that you've created 6 months, a year down the line, when all of a sudden something happens that means that the model isn't flexible enough. It hasn't been thought of. There hasn't been enough collaboration to understand the impact. I went to the Fabric London user group. I was talking at the user group, but I was talking on technology, right? I was talking about a specific feature within Fabric called Materialize Lake Views. A little segue from our conversation, but it's a feature. It's a feature in a piece of software from a vendor. Johnny Winter was there and he was talking about data modeling. He was talking about sunbeam modeling. And this is a modeling practice that I've used in the past only because Johnny Winter has been talking about it, because it brings together a couple of areas of data modeling that I have used. I just never thought there was this portmanteau of these things. BEAM, Business Event Analysis Modeling from Lawrence Core, and the great Agile Data Warehouse, Jim Stagnito, and Mark Whithorn, which I now know is the pronunciation, who was championing sun modeling in terms of a central event. And then your sunbeams were your reference data in terms of how you brought context to that data. And of course, that was just the modeling aspect. But Johnny then started to show a tool called LEAI, and that really got me thinking. So this is a data modeling tool in which it's focused on data modeling. It's focused on understanding how to build enterprise data warehouses, how to help someone and guide them through the process of creating a data model. And it's very different from something like a data warehouse automation tool, right? So there's data warehouse automation tools out there, Warescape and such, in which you pretty much have to know the modeling pattern while you're using these tools. Whereas all of a sudden I'm looking at LEAI and thinking, oh, okay, I get this now. It is essentially an LLM, or maybe multiple LLMs, that's been trained on data modeling, perhaps on architecture, layout patterns, technology even, because it can help it then shape how it, helps the user as they prompt their way to a data model. And at first I looked at it and thought, it's just another AI tool. There's millions of AI tools out there now. But I did think, hang on, if this is an AI tool that's helping people data model, this can only be a good thing. This could only be of benefit to people to use something like this to help them through the process of modeling. They've got the technology. They can use Copilot or ChatGPT to help them write code, but they've got these tools with the subject matter expertise of data modeling to help them and guide them through getting to a state where they might not have these problems in 6, 9, 12 months' time of a model that isn't flexible enough, because they can prompt their way into flexibility. So that was what I was looking at specifically with the AI tools, Shane. So I'm curious to think about what you think about somebody who doesn't have much domain expertise in data modeling, but is working in the data space using these AI tools for modeling.
There's a lot to unpack there. I've just made a whole page of notes. So let me go through from the beginning what you talked about and replay it back and my thoughts around it. I like your point around opinionated tools. If I think back in previous waves of technology for the data space, the tool really supported one modeling pattern. Yeah, and realistically, it was Kimball. Kimball was the number one data modeling patent that I ever saw in data warehousing in the old days. And that was because he wrote good books. He shared his content online with his blog, which was free and easy to access, and he ran great courses. So getting access to how to model, he was the most accessible piece of content that you could find, and it made sense. I'm a big Data Vault fan. I like the physical Data Vault modeling pattern. I'm not a fan of the Data Vault BI methodology, but I find that content and access to how to model using the Data Vault pattern of hubsets and links is incredibly hard to find. It is poorly written. It is paywalled. And so I think that's why we see with the advent of DBT and when people started to realizing they had to model data consciously, we saw Kimball take off again, right? Because old content is still valid. Just on that though, I was really intrigued about your SCD2 comment. So let's take a segue on that and I'll come back to the AI stuff in a minute. Because I remember with the original ETL tools that we were using, there was never a native SCD2 node. We used to always have to bloody well write that node ourselves. And then when the cloud analytics databases came out, it would have just made sense for me for SCD2 behavior, that pattern of historical recording of change data, to be a database feature, not be a piece of code to detect the change and store it, but just make it a feature in the database to say this table is SCD type 2 table, because the database could take care of that change detection, the end dating or the flagging of a current as record. And so it's really interesting that SCD type 2 is one of the patterns that you use for dimensional modeling all the time when you're physically modeling using that pattern. But somehow we still seem to be lumbered with write some code that deals with it. Is that your experience? Are you still seeing people having to write code to implement the type 2 pattern?
Yes, I am, basically. And this was even talked about a few days ago. So I was at a little conference in Birmingham called FabFest, which was focused on Microsoft Fabric. And I was speaking about a function called, or a feature called materialized lake views, which is essentially like Databricks' Delta Live Tables or Lakeflow declarative pipelines, as they've called now, because they're abstracting it away from Delta, because it's not just Delta that this technology supports, but also DBT. And someone said, why have we not got this SED out-of-the-box functionality? Because it's almost like slowly changing dimensions they've transcended the specific methodology in which it would be used in. And what I mean by that is when you started learning Kimball and you started learning dimensional modeling, one of the subcategories was dimensions, and one of the subcategories was slowly changing dimensions. And all of these different types. So type 2 has probably now become the champion, right? It's the one that will track changes over time by adding new rows of data and the associated metadata to keep it. Yes, there are type 4 and type 6 and type 3, and all of those have their reasons to implement them. Type 3, you've got multiple columns which can store the current data and then the previous amounts of data. But they are a little bit more difficult to implement. So most of the time, people will use slowly changing dimension type 2 because that's the one that is the most relevant, the most prevalent, and the ones that's easy to implement. However, unless you're using some tools that have this functionality inbuilt, like I said, DBT have functionality called snapshots. Bricks in their Lakeflow declarative pipelines, you can declare an SCD type. It's not massively prevalent and soaked in to the data landscape. So this person I remember at this conference was saying, I'm still having to write my code to implement my slowly changing dimension. I'm still having to say, these are the columns that I would like to track. This is the key that I would like to join on. These are my columns that I've defined for my metadata, my from, my to, my is active, if you have that. Any other metadata columns that you want to be able to track your changes. Then, and my last point on this is we look at the medallion architecture. Right now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of should we call it the medallion architecture, because to my mind, it's a data layout pattern. It's not necessarily an architecture, but it has these different zones of data. We know raw is bronze and silver is cleansed and gold is modeled. But silver, which is the cleansed data, it hasn't yet got to a stage in which it's been modeled to a specific pattern. There's a lot of advocates that want to apply slowly changing dimension functionality to that silver data, but it's not modeled yet. It's existing at the same granularity as the raw data. Obviously, it's gone through dedupes and it's gone through cleansing and all that kind of stuff, but it's not modeled yet. But we're applying something that was a modeling pattern or a modeling feature into this store of data. So I find that quite interesting as well, is that this SCD has almost been extracted as a feature of a modeling pattern and can just now be used as a way of tracking changes over time. But to your point, I just don't see enough of that functionality automatically added to database and data products. People are still having to do it themselves.
And that affects adoption. Because if we say that a simple technical pattern of type 2 implementation, where we know what the patterns are, right? We know that is detect change, insert row, start date, end date, if that's what you like, is active or is current as a flag. We could actually just add all of those. And I remember in the early days when we were constrained on database technology, where the cost of those servers was expensive, the cost of the licenses were horrendous, we had to optimize to reduce costs. You probably remember it. We would argue type 1 versus type 2. And we would type 1 by default, and we would type 2 where we knew there was value because the cost of type 2 was higher than type 1. Now with cloud analytics databases, we really don't give a shit. We just type 2 everything because we can, and it saves us problems later, and people are more expensive than those databases. And so we can be lazy to a degree, but there's value in being lazy. What's interesting for me is that pattern is a very well-known pattern, yet it hasn't become opinionated in tools. And when we talk about data modeling patterns, do we go Snowflake versus Star versus Data Vault versus Anchor versus Hook versus Unified Star Schema versus Anchor? There's all these other patterns where actually they're a little bit harder to be opinionated about, and therefore they're harder to bake into a tool. So if we can't do the simple stuff, how do we expect to do the hard stuff? And then the last thing I'll say before we move on to the next part of your point that you had earlier was, your silver's not mine. I think Medallion has been great because it's reinvigorated the conversation around layered data architectures and the value of them. But when you talk about your silver has been cleansed, I talk about my silver as designed, and I model. We have an opinionated data modeling pattern, which is concepts, details, and events. That's how we model and what we call our silver. Our raw is historized. We are effectively applying an SCD2 type pattern on our raw data for a whole lot of reasons. So again, the problem with Medallion is it's a nice way of describing a layered architecture, but as soon as we get into any detail of what you've got in your layer, it's not what I've got in my layer. And that's okay, as long as you tell me that you're cleansing in silver and it matches the structure of your source, and you tell me you model in gold, I get it now. I get your architecture by you just using those words, that opinion you have applied. So I think that's the key. There's no more, there's only one way to Medallion. It's, what do you mean by silver? So let's jump on then, and then let's talk about tools, because in the past we had tools like Irwin, EA Sparks. We had some really hard to use data modeling tools to draw diagrams of what our models look like. And typically they were completely disconnected. We found it really hard to draw a diagram for our conceptual and physical model and then get that model instantiated in our database easily. In the modern data stack, in the previous wave, now that it's dead, we saw tools like LE and SQL DBM. We saw visual modeling tools come out. But what was interesting is they became a category. They were a part of your stack. So if you had a modern data stack, you'd end up with 5 to 10 different tools to do your end-to-end processing. And we've seen a lot of consolidation in the market. We've seen a lot of those tools that are part of the stack disappear or get acquired or become features in one of the other tools. But we haven't seen that for data modeling. We haven't seen the data modeling capability being brought back into those end-to-end stacks. And again, I don't do a lot of work in Fabric, but I don't think, apart from the Power BI SQL Server analysis services part of the Microsoft stack, they've never really had a modeling tool, have they? There's no tool I would go into that would help me create a conceptual or a physical data model and instantiate the physical model in a database within the Microsoft stack, or is there?
So this is probably one of the most asked questions in forums around the data modeling aspect, because as you've said, we've had tools over the years that have enabled us to do data modeling. Even SQL Server Management Studio, which you can download for free, has got this almost live data modeling process attached to it, where, yes, it's very much a physical design pattern. You can't logically design something in its interface. In Fabric, we're still there. We haven't got anything that's going to help us logically design a data model out of the box. There's nothing that we can start with and say, okay, I want to start with a conceptual data model. I want to go down into a logical design, and then finally a physical design of my lakehouse, of my warehouse. We're having to still use other tools to be able to do that. So whether people still use Visio, whether they're using other things, Archimate or SQL Database Modeler, I think even Toad for these kind of modeling tools. One of the things that I didn't like is when Microsoft did deprecate some of the data modeling tools that were available within Visual Studio. I just thought, you've got to have something that can help a process. When I look at Fabric or even Databricks, Snowflake, all of these sort of cloud vendors, is they are the canvas, they are the paintbrush, but they don't help you draw the picture. You need a process to go and help you draw that picture. And there are cloud tools that help you do the data modeling. Some of them, I think a lot of them are paid, because to go from conceptual to logical and then physical is a natural progression. People want to be able to create the physical data models. Ultimately, yes, some people might be a little bit annoyed that they're forced to go through the conceptual and the logical modeling processes before they get down to the physical. But then they want to be able to click a button and it generates the code necessary for them to run and create that physical model. No, I don't see anything. And if we're talking about Microsoft Fabric specifically, I don't see anything in Microsoft Fabric that's going to help you from the conceptual all the way down into the physical.
And again, software should be opinionated. So the way we do it is I create the conceptual model and then it generates a physical model without me doing anything, because our physical model is opinionated. So our conceptual model is open in terms of the things you create, the concepts, the who does what, because I'm a great Beam fan as well. Lawrence Core's book is one of the ones I read early. When I had my consulting company in New Zealand, when pre-COVID, when things went online, we used to fly them over as often as we could to teach our customers how to beam and event model their data, because it was so useful. And that idea of your conceptual model of who does what, your core concepts, depends on the industry, depends on the business case, the usage, the actions and outcomes you want to take. So it is a little bit less opinionated to a degree. But once you've got that sorted, you can make your physical modeling pattern incredibly opinionated. And that's why I think these disconnected data modeling tools are struggling, from what I can tell. And you're starting to see them now bring in the ability to actually generate the ETL, the code to deploy the model and load the model, because that's the space you have to be in. You have to be able to create the model and test that it has value. And so when I come back to the AI tools, I've played a lot with the LLMs, played a lot with the bots, and I can see as a helper friend, as an assistant, it allows me to ask questions and provide some context around the industry, the use case, and get back a starter model for 10. And that's really useful. But if I think back to this idea of the mentoring I had early in my career by those grumpy data modelers, what they used to do is they used to stress test the model. There was something magical about the way you could give them a data model They could just look at it and then they could call bollocks on the things you got wrong. It was just that innate pattern matching in their heads because they'd done it so often, and they could go, yeah, that relationship's not a one to many, it's a many to many, it's not going to survive. Okay, the rate of change on that table is going to be horrendous. You're going to go blow out your Oracle instance, yeah, or you have to upgrade to Oracle RAC, which will cost you 2 legs, 1 arm, and your 3 newborn children. I wonder if that actually is where AI tools have to take us, is effectively an agent model, right? Where there is one that helps us build the model and one that helps us stress test the model, which goes back to that point you made a long time ago, which was when we work with technology, we get instantaneous feedback that the technology is working or it's not. When we work with data modeling, we don't. So maybe that's where the AI tools need to take us, help it to create it, and then another agent, which is grumpy old data modeler that tells you where you got it wrong. What do you think?
So I think AI can help all the way through that process. And this is where we start to look at AI as less as a technical tool that will help us do something and more as a sounding board, as something that we can ask it to be quite antagonistic with. As you said, and like I raised the subject earlier about AI tools and helping with data modeling, is you could go to an AI tool and say, someone has told me to design XYZ system. For argument's sake, let's say it's a data warehouse or it's a lake house, and we're going to use a data modeling technique that is best for reporting and analytics. And the LLM might reply and say, okay, well, here are a few modeling patterns, and dimensional modeling is the one that you would use for a data warehouse, and so on and so forth. So let's say they then pick that and carry on doing that. They'll then ask it questions about, I've got all these different entities in my source system. How will a dimensional model help me? So it will then work through those entities and say, okay, you've got these entities that look like they can be grouped together. Perhaps that's a dimension, and it will work through the process with you. So let's say you've got that sorted. So you've applied your critical thinking and not just accepted everything that the LLM has given you. You've gone back and maybe you've Googled, maybe you've asked other people that are experts in that area to say, okay, you know what, I've spent a whole day generating this model. It would have taken me 2 weeks if I had to learn the theory and then do it. What do you think? I'm sense checking it. Someone might come back and say, okay, we can tweak a couple of things, but actually that looks pretty good. Great. So we've got our starting point. Then you talked about stress testing. And yes, so this is where you can then ask the LLM to be antagonistic and say, so this is my data model. We've got here because the business want to be able to report on these X number of attributes, and this is how they want to measure it. But I know that there are other source systems and things like that. Can you tell me what problems this model might have in the future? And of course, you're asking the AI to try and do some future proofing for you and some troubleshooting. And it might come back with some generic questions about perhaps your product dimension isn't deep enough. What about other entities that you might need to bring in that you haven't yet got links in your fact tables? But it's going to help surface potential problems for you to then deal with. So I totally get that as well. And then the third point that I want to add is about anticipating changes. We touched on Lawrence Core and the Agile Data Warehouse book a little bit earlier, which, yes, is something that I go back to constantly. And we've got Beam in there to help us do this. But the Agile Data Warehouse is also there to help us iterate over a model as well. So perhaps we then say to the LLM, look, this first version of the model, okay, we've got to set it in stone now because we've got project deadlines. We need to get the data in because the business are going to build X amount of reports. And we tried to make the model as generic as possible because we don't want a report-driven model. We want the data-driven model in here. But help us understand what we might need to do to modify the model and be a little bit agile. So I would say that the usage of the AI tools to help us generate the model is just the first part. Most of it is going to be about asking the model to be quite antagonistic about the model it's generated. Yeah, I think that it'll help us build the model, But the most important thing is antagonize the model, test it, hopefully point people in the right direction in terms of future proofing, and certainly surface issues that might happen in the future. They might need to fix those issues. I don't think I've worked with a dimensional model yet that doesn't incur a certain amount of technical debt in how it's implemented. But if you can mitigate those things earlier on, that's just going to be of benefit. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on that, Shane.
Yeah, and that's that problem between doing a model quickly that gets value now and trying to boil the ocean for all changes in the future, or an enterprise data model. Again, going back to that anti-pattern we have these days of a data modeler sitting in a room for 2 years doing one enterprise data model to rule them all that nobody implements. One of the things we're doing is we've been experimenting in this space, and we have a bunch of partners use our platform, and we got one of them to experiment. And we had a use case around Google Ads. So the partner needed to bring Google Ads data in and deliver it for a customer. And so that first part of the agent, that opinionated agent that's going to help you do the initial model, was really interesting. So what we found was, first thing was, we were lucky that Google Ads gave us effectively context about the tables. It brought in metadata that described the tables quite well. So that was really valuable for the agent because it now got a bunch of hints of what the source data looked like. The next thing was, we have an opinionated design pattern for the way we model. And so our agent already knew about that. So it knew what the rules of the game was. It knew it couldn't dimensionally model it. It knew it couldn't anchor. It knew all the patterns it couldn't use. It knew what our pattern looked like. So that opinion was effectively already in the agent as a bunch of rules. We also gave it the information product canvas that our partner had done, which is a description of what the actions and outcomes and business questions that need to be answered first. And what that gave was a boundary to the agent to say, don't model all the Google Ads data, only model the data that's going to support this outcome. Yeah. So again, it gave it a boundary that let it lightly model. Now, what we didn't do was the bit that you're just raising, is then stress test change, right? We didn't say what's going to happen next, but we can't deal with that in different ways at the moment. But I'm going to think about that one really well. So boundary of opinion that was given to the modeling agent meant it did a good job. If I had just said to it, I've got Google Ads data and model it, I have a theory, and I'm going to go test this. I reckon every time I ask it that, even though it's non-deterministic, it's going to Kimball model it. And the reason I say that is, if you think about why has Kimball and dimensional modeling become the number one modeling technique for DBT? Because if you're an analyst and you're moving into that engineering space and you hear that you need to model some stuff and you use an LLM or you go Google search, you're going to come back with dimensional modeling every time. Because as I said, it's the most freely available described content in the world for data modeling in an analytics space, in my opinion. And so therefore, the LLMs who trained on everybody else's content without paying for it, we won't go into that one, it's going to have the richest piece of content in the LLM for dimensional modeling. So interesting question on that one is, actually, if I go and ask an LLM to model it with no constraint, no opinion, I bet it will come back with Kimball modeling. What do you think?
And I think the LLM would probably not be displaying any emotion. So let me expand on that. So you touched on Data Vault earlier, and you say that's a data modeling pattern that you like. If we go back several years, actually decades, we're talking about Kimball versus Inman. We were talking about dimensional modeling versus third normal form. Then Dan Lindstead comes along and we've got Data Vault. There was lots of emotion involved in people comparing these technologies. In fact, all of those people, Bill Inman, Dan Lindstead, Ralph Kimball, they all said, and it's in their books, that these modeling patterns are complementary. Bill Inman would say your enterprise data warehouse can be third normal form, but for reporting and for feeding into analytical tools, Kimball model, the dimensional model, is great. Kimball would say, okay, you can do that, but yeah, you can also do your enterprise data warehouse in dimensional modeling. Okay, there might be a little bit difference of opinion there, but they were still complementary. Even Data Vault. Data Vault, you can't just plug straight into analytics and tools. And I will admit and agree that it's great for tracking changes over time in the lowest level of granularity, giving you the most flexibility to do what you want with it afterwards. but a dimensional model is very good in plugging it in. But of course, we see all those debates out there, this versus this, that versus this. The LLM will take those arguments into consideration, but it has no bias. It has no emotion attached to any of those modeling patterns. So I would say that LLM will probably come out with dimensional modeling because it'll reason that, okay, you can store your data this way, but it's not going to be what you need to design the model that's going to be delivered to the business. And I would like to test this as well and antagonize an LLM around these modeling patterns and ask it, okay, I'm going to be designing this. What do you think the best model is going to be? And then I might add in a few tripwires to it and say, what about Data Vault and what about this? And I'm hoping that the LLM would say, yes, you can use those modeling patterns, but it's generally agreed that they are complementary and that you can add on a dimensional modeling pattern to a third normal form or a Data Vault. But I am hoping that the AI has less, shall we say, emotion attached to picking that data modeling pattern.
If it's got no emotion, we should ask it for a definition of data product, semantic layer, and other things we love to argue. I'm gonna disagree with you on that one. And the reason is I don't think LLMs are reasoning. They are pattern matching and tokenization based on a bunch of content. And my hypothesis, and it is just a hypothesis, is the Kimball and dimensional content has been far more widely available, and therefore that model has a bias towards using it. However, it's just a hypothesis. And one of the things that Joe Reese has been doing as part of the practical data modeling community is just testing stuff live with a bunch of people. I'm going to suggest you and I do that. I suggest that we figure out how to do a live session. We bring up in multiple LLMs and with a bunch of other people watching or helping us, we just bash the snot out of it and try and see, actually, is there a bias for a modeling technique? But if I take that away for now, your comment around Sunbeam really intrigued me because Johnny's mentioned it before and I struggled to find any content around it. It's one of those data modeling patterns that is actually quite hard to find anything about it. And good point. I need to get somebody on the podcast to come and explain it. So if I wanted an LLM to assist me in designing a Sunbeam model, because I'm opinionated, that's the model I prefer, for whatever reason, I think it's going to struggle. And that will be another test. Maybe we can give it a bash on that to see. So I think if you're using an LLM to assist you in modeling and you are using a well-known pattern that you are opinionated about, so Data Vault, dimensional, third normal form, anchor potentially, then you probably don't need to use a lot of reinforcement with the LLM because it knows what you're talking about. If you wanted to bring in some of the more obscure modeling patterns like Sunbeam, I think you're going to actually have to pass it a reinforcement of that content. So one of the interesting things about Joe Reese and what he does with the practical data community is he does live sessions where we all jump on, screen share, and we actually test out a hypothesis. And so one of the ones that he did was this idea of, could we start with a business problem in an industry none of us knew, get the LLM to help us understand the industry, create a conceptual model, move it to a logical model, move it to a physical model, and actually implement that physical model in a database. And that was fun. But what was interesting for me was observing the way Joe approached it. And he comes from more of a data science background than I do. So he tended, in my view, what I saw was approach it from an EDA, an exploratory data analysis approach. So he would be looking at the data sources and trying to understand the data that's coming in because that's how he thought. Whereas for me, I come from more of a business background. That's how I've been trained. So more of that who does what business process stuff along the Beam first part of the book. And so for me, I typically want to understand the who does what's, the core business events, the core concepts, and that's how I model. So again, I think in terms of an AI assistant that helps you model, you probably want to train it around your modeling process. Or maybe you don't. Actually, maybe the LLM should decide what inputs it needs rather than you being opinionated on how you typically model. What do you think? First of all, which way do you model? Do you think source specific and understand the data first, or do you try and understand the core business events? And then do you think you should be opinionated to the LLM about which way it should approach it?
I've always modeled from the source system side of things and then taken into consideration the requirements from the business. And I know why that is. And that's because I'm fundamentally a technical person. So I'll always want to default to looking at the technical aspects of things. Hey, I can look at source systems. I can understand schemas. I can understand tables and columns and the domain values within that. And then I can look at matching that to what the business want. And I've worked with people that work the other way around. They are interested in the art of the possible. They're interested in what do the business need to make the decisions, and then let's go and find what we need from those source systems. So I've moved my needle a little bit more towards the art of the possible. Right, this is what the business ultimately needs in terms of decision making, if they need to be more operationally efficient, if they want to take advantage of opportunities in the market, challenge competitors, whatever. I then go and look at those source systems and see what's available. And then sometimes you really can't realize some of that data that is needed for the business, right? Because it's just out of the hands of those source systems. And I suppose you could calculate it and you could infer it from that data. But I've tended to work that way. And then interestingly, when you were talking about AI and Joe working through the kind of modeling aspects from that perspective, yes, I can totally see someone asking the model to work with them in a specific way and say, right, here is my source system. This is what I need to do. Now, when those source systems, and if you've got access to schemas and you can provide that schema to an LLM, and let's say it's an LLM that's secure, it's within your organization or it's within your data boundaries, so you can give the LLM that schema, and then you ask it to model that for you. You may then ask that LLM, I need to join it with other systems as well, and this is the system and this is the schema, so it could then help you generate the model to incorporate multiple systems, or showing you some examples about how you can join those systems together. What I wouldn't want an LLM to do is just go crazy with the business requirements and say, okay, this business operates in this domain, so this is all of the data that they need to be ultra competitive and at the top of their game. And then I've got to scrabble around trying to desperately find where I'm going to get this data from that the model says is going to help me build the perfect data model for the business. I guess I'm a data modeling pragmatist. I would look at the source systems and I would look at how they support the business in what they want to do. And then I would probably work with the LLM in that fashion. I'd be saying, okay, here's the framing, here's the context, this is what we need to measure, but this is what we've got in our source systems. And this is the hard facts about what we've got in the source systems. Help me build that model that can realize what the business wants, but work within the limits of what I've got with those source systems. So that's what I would do.
I was just thinking then back to my point about the enterprise data modeler sitting in the cupboard for 2 years to come out with the most beautiful data model ever. That's basically a person going into an LLM now and saying, you have no constraints. Here's the industry. Give me a data model from scratch that does everything. It's quicker. It's not 2 years, but it's just as unimplementable. That's a bad word. One of the things we found was, think about ChatGPT 5 and this idea that we didn't get the AGI that we expected, but what we got was a better interface. So instead of having to decide what type of LLM foundational model you wanted to use, you tell it what you want to achieve and it works out which model is the best fit for you. And one of the things we found when we were experimenting was if we had one agent, our agent's called 80, if we asked her to do everything, she was okay at it, but she wasn't great. When we broke her out into sub-agents, so we had agent 80, the data modeler, 80, the what we call change rules, like the ability to write ETL. And we gave her clearer opinions and a clearer boundary. We got a really good uplift in the accuracy, right? And the evals that we got back in terms of we got better responses that made our lives easier. And so one of the things when I'm teaching my Canvas, I actually use something that Laura's talked about, right? Which is modeling based on source, modeling based on report, or modeling based on business process. It's one of the things that stuck with me for many years. And so now I'm thinking based on that, what we really probably need is an agent that we can go to and say, give us a model based on the source system. And another agent, we can say, give us a model based on the core business events or business processes or the who does what. And a third one where we go, give us a model based on outcome. And then we give it the constraints of what we actually want to achieve in the next iteration. What do we actually have to deliver? And we get it to model it for us. So based on those three, tell us what the actual optimal model is to achieve this outcome, and then stress test it for me. So that it's getting a bunch of inputs, right? Because if I think about it, that's what great modelers do. They take a stance, but then they always jump. You're technical, you source first. But then you go, right, now what are the core business events? Customer orders product, good. I don't need to worry about store ships product in this iteration. So I'm only modeling in that boundary. And then, okay, what do we know we have to deliver? Is it a dashboard? Is it a data service? And then you're using that to iterate your initial stance of that model until you get something that is fit for purpose. If I think about it, that's what we do as humans. So that's probably the process we need to encourage the LLMs to do. What do you think?
I like that idea of asking each of those models to come up with their specific version based on those constraints. You do it by source system. You do it by business process. And then getting them to antagonize each other in terms of getting to a realistic result, taking on board each of those aspects. And what I did make me laugh in my head when you were talking about a great modeler is that in the Rocky films, there was Apollo Creed who said to Rocky that you fight great, but I'm a great fighter. And I think that about the modeling domain as well. You can point at a person and say, you model great, but I'm a great modeler. And that's just built up through experience. That's just built up through battle-tested models that you've created over the years and iterating over those models over the years. And like you said in a couple of points before about the LLMs generating these models and coming up with dimensional models, because that's what the prevalent documentation will have. Those models have been trained over that documentation. So those models will be like, okay, this seems to be the most popular way of doing things. So then when those LLMs are generating a model based on a source system, it's going to be based on the context of them understanding that source system and what the output of that source system is. I look at something like dynamics, which has generally been something that is quite difficult to model when so much customization happens within the platform. There is no real vanilla implementation of dynamics, which means that the LLM is going to have to understand business context, not just source system, because I guess the source system is just going to have all these entities that it might think, I don't have any information because those sorts of things haven't been discussed before. And as human beings, I guess we can reason over those things and we can hypothesize and we can make a best guess and iterate over. Perhaps the LLM can't really do that because it's been trained on previous data, previous examples, and it doesn't have the ability to think out of the box if it hasn't encountered something before. Yeah, interesting point there, Shane.
Although I would posit that it probably has encountered it because it's got access to information outside of data warehouse, data modeling. So it's going to have all the books on Dynamics implementations. It's going to have all the blog posts of people who have customized it. But yeah, I get your point, especially things like SAP, where who knows how that bloody thing works. It's going to have more knowledge than I do on that, but less knowledge than an enterprise SAP data modeler who does it for a thing. So again, I think it comes back to being clear about when you want to provide an opinion or when you don't. So when you want to provide an opinion because it's important that the LLM or the agent stays within that boundary for you, or where you just leave it because it, in theory, has access to more expertise and knowledge than you have in a specific space. And so if we go back to Medallion, if we go back to layered data architectures, that's actually a really good place where you might want to be opinionated. Because if you're saying, I want you to help me do a conceptual model, you probably don't care about your layered architecture. But if you're saying, I want you to help me create physical models that I'm going to implement, and I know that my layered architecture is I have a designed layer that is concepts, details, and events, and my consume layer is a one big table. And I know that your cleanse layer is source-specific data structured with data being cleansed, and your gold layer is, I'm guessing, a dimensional model. if each of us had the same agent, but we put in those opinionated boundaries, we're going to get back physical data models that are more fit for purpose for us to implement in our platforms of choice. And realistically, if the LLM came back to you and said, throw away your dimensional models and do one big table from cleansed, you're probably going to look at that and go, the cost of change is quite high. I really need to understand why you're making me do that, because I have to learn a whole lot of new things and I have to rebuild everything. So I think, again, being opinionated where you want to be opinionated that makes sense is important. And then being free and hippie and open to whatever the great AI agent in the world tells us as a startup for 10, and then stress testing it with expertise. I think that's where we're going to end up. What do you think?
So I think that opinionated aspect is quite important in terms of how you approach the LLM, because being opinionated about something means that you've got strong convictions in how you want to do something, which then also means that someone else could be opinionated and have strong opinions in how they want to do something. And as we know, over the years, when you've been working with other people that have experience doing these things, there might be a crossover, there might be some differences of opinions. How is the LLM going to know those differences of opinions that you can work out and collaborate on? Yes, it's got this body of knowledge. Hopefully, the people with the opinions have been providing information, writing books, writing blog posts that the LLM can take on board and learn and use. But if I come to a project and use an LLM to create my medallion, and I also ask it to create my data model based on my biases and based on my experience and the way that I want to do things, I'm probably going to guide the LLM to a certain conclusion. Someone else is going to come along and say, I want to start this project. I want to lay my data out. Do you have some thoughts about how I want to lay it out? I have used this in the past, and then I want to use data modeling to do it. It might come up with a slightly different outcome based on your own strength of conviction and your biases that you've put into the LLM. It might come back with something that is generic at first, but then you might say to the LLM, actually, I don't want my historization in silver. I want it in raw because that's traditionally where I've put it. Whereas someone else could say, okay, why have you asked me to put my historization in raw? I've learned that it's supposed to be in silver. But if we remove the LLM from this conversation for a second, it's almost like we'd get the same outcome if it was just humans. Because humans would go into an organization, implement a data platform, and based on their experience and biases, they would implement it a certain way. A different set of people could go into that same organization and implement it slightly different. So I don't think we're necessarily solving the problem of these differences of opinions or the convictions that you have. It's just using another tool to help possibly reason, to help possibly have this entire body of knowledge and experience at our disposal that we can interrogate and hopefully get to a more human/AI reasoned outcome. That's what I use it for. So I would use AI to help me model based on my experience, but I'm also not going to be arrogant enough to think I know everything there is to know about data modeling. So I also want to ask it questions about, have we thought about it this way or have we thought about it the other way? Just so that I can bring a little bit of critical thinking to it as well, and then evaluate the outcome. Yeah, it's an interesting point there, Shane.
I like that where you got to, is because it goes back to where we started, which is if you're new to the data domain and you want to understand data modeling, there really isn't a lot of great content apart from the Kimball stuff around, and there are other techniques. So now LLMs give us access to ask questions and effectively get educated on what the art of the possible is. What could I do? The second thing is the mentors, the grumpy people who could just look at your model and tell you where you got it wrong. They're not really so prevalent in organizations anymore for some reason. So again, using the LLM to provide that expertise, that rigor, that stress testing, that feedback is really valuable. There is another lens, but we don't have time to go into detail, but I'll just drop it in here because maybe we come back and have another chat about this idea when you've thought about it a bit, which is centralized platforms may disappear. So if we think about CRMs, they are centralized platforms that everybody uses with a core bunch of features. They've been built in a way that become reusable. And what we're seeing now with vibe coding is actually you could build one feature, one app that does one thing really well, really quickly. And it doesn't need to be part of a shared platform. And that's going to be a really interesting change in the market when that happens. That also means that you can vibe code something that has 30,000 lines of code. And while you should know what it does, potentially you don't need to care because if it's safe and secure, it does the job. Actually, you don't need the expertise to understand how it does it. If we apply that to the data domain and this idea of moving away from shared data platforms, the fact that I've created this information product that does one thing well, and I've got the LLM to design 5 different architecture data layers using 17 different data modeling techniques and a bunch of code I don't understand. As long as it doesn't have to be reusable, then maybe we don't care anymore. And again, I'm old. I find reuse really valuable. I find expertise and shared language really important. But maybe the new world is one and done information products where the LLMs are doing everything completely different each time you deliver a product. But we're out of time, so I'm going to leave that one on the table. Maybe have a think about it, and that could be a good follow-up conversation around how would we use AI and LLMs to remove the need for reuse and shared platforms in the new age world. But before we finish off, how do people find you? How do they see what you're reading, what you're writing? You're obviously spending a lot of time going to some great conferences, what those conferences are and how they can find you.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is Linktree. So Linktree is basically my go-to in terms of a jumping off point for people to find me. So that's basically Linktree/Andy Cutler. So ANDYCUTLER. Because that'll take you to my company, so datahigh.com. That'll take you to my community blog, which is serverlesssequel.com. There's my Blue Sky account. There's YouTube, which is Data High, and then my LinkedIn as well. So the Linktree, Andy Cutler, will take you to everything you need to do. Most of the conferences, I am in the Microsoft space and predominantly Fabric, which is where I spend, as the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air would say, most of my days. The next conference is over in Oslo. So that is Fabric February. So that's going to be over in Oslo. There's obviously SQL Bits, which is one of the UK's biggest data conferences as well. So I would say I generally post on LinkedIn blog posts, opinions, lots of conversation as well. And as I said, yeah, Linktree, Andy Cutler, that's where you'll find me.
Excellent. All right. Hey, thanks for a great chat around AI and LLMs and data modeling. And I hope everybody has a simply magical day. And that, Data Magicians, was another Agile Data podcast episode. If you want to learn new patterns that you can apply to craft your own Agile Data way of working, head over to agiledata.io.